Whenever you watch Magnus or Hikaru play, they just know what to do in almost any given position. They can come up with candidate moves instantaneously, while a lot of people are struggling to come up with ideas. They get out of the opening and they don't know what to do. In this video, I'm going to teach you what you should be looking for in positions where you don't know what to do. So let's take a look at this position right here. And the first thing I want you to evaluate for the white pieces is the development and the activity of the pieces. Now, you might say that the bishop on g3, rook on e1, and the queen on d2 are all developed, but the rook on a1 is not developed. It's in the corner, it's on the starting square, it's not developed whatsoever. And we can develop it in a couple of different ways. First of all, we cannot move the rook to d1 right away. That would hang the pawn on a2. Let's say we play a move like a3, for example. It's a very passive move. It's not a good move. And let's say our opponent plays a move like rook to d8, and now we bring the rook to d1. Let's say we get into a position like this, for example. Now, whenever we're looking at a position like this, the problem with this position is that even though on paper all four of white's pieces are developed, none of them are really active. And that might seem kind of weird. Okay, I developed these pieces. I brought the rooks to the center. The queen is on d2. The bishop is on g3. But none of them are really doing anything because the queen and rook are blocked out this way. Okay, queen has the most activity. It can go over here, so it has some options. This rook is on e1, but it's not really doing anything because this wall of pawns by black is doing a great job of restricting the rook, and the bishop is also being restricted by the same wall of pawns. So none of these pieces are really active, and that's the one thing that you have to realize. Bringing them to these central squares, it's very arbitrary. Just because pieces are in the center does not mean that they are active. Now that we got that out of the way, let's go back to this position right here and let's look at our options. If we know that this is not very active on d1 and this rook and this bishop, they're not very active on these pieces, how can we activate them? How can we make them as good as possible? So this is about maximizing the value of your pieces. And for that, you need a pawn break. Now, what is a pawn break? A pawn break is when you strike either in the center or on the edge of the board and you're trying to get rid of pawns. You're trying to exchange your pawns for your opponent's pawns in order to open up the position. And that is what pawn breaks are useful for, and that is what you need in this position. So if you look at this position, how many pawn breaks do we have? We have this pawn break a4, challenging this pawn. We have d4 and we have f4. And as it turns out, two of these moves are good. One of them is not so good. It's debatable. It's probably inaccurate. It's not losing or anything. But in my opinion, the best move in this position is this move, pawn to f4. Why is pawn to f4 such a good move? We are attacking the pawn on e5. The pawn cannot be pushed because if the pawn is pushed, we just simply take it. And if black takes the pawn on f4, of course, we then take the queen and we have a winning position. We are up a queen. But the thing is that even if our opponent, let's say, moves the queen away to d5, what happens now? Now we can use this pawn to capture on e5, and now there's a big difference. You remember earlier there was this wall of pawn restricting all of these pieces, but after f4, all of a sudden the wall of pawns is gone and we're actually pressuring this pawn on e5. And not only are we pressuring the pawn on e5, we're actually winning it, because after a move like queen to e3, this pawn is actually impossible to defend. How do you defend this pawn? You have to play something like c5, and then we take on e5 anyways. Yes, we are pinned, but we can move the queen and unpin from this position. Now, this is a very nice position for the white pieces if we are able to activate these pieces. So sometimes you're going to get into these situations where your pieces look active, but they're not really all that active because you need open lines, you need open diagonals, you need actual targets, and you have none of those in this position. But after f4, all of a sudden you have All three of those, open diagonal, an actual target on e5, and also this open line with an actual target on e5. So that is why this move is so powerful. Instead of playing moves like rook to d1 and making these arbitrary decisions such as this rook is not useful, it's not active, it's not developed on d1 just because you brought it to the center. So that is a concept that I want you guys to internalize. Now going back, let's look at some other options here. We also have this option of playing a4, which is also a very nice move, because when we play a move like a4, now we are actually activating the rook on a1. So rook to d1 doesn't activate the rook, but a4, which is not even a rook move, it's a pawn move, activates this rook. Why? Because we're threatening to, it's not a threat, it would be a trade, but we're going to take on b5 and we're going to open up and activate our rook. For example, our opponent plays a move like queen d6. First of all, the pawn cannot be pushed because we would simply capture it. And if queen to d6 is played, we can capture here. Let's say our opponent takes with the a pawn. Now we have activated our rook. We have the a file. We can infiltrate and we can fully take control over the a file. So this is an option that opened for us after we played a4. Similarly with d4, we are trying to get rid of this pawn wall, similarly to f4 I should say. d4 is similar to f4, however there's a problem, and that's the fact that this queen is on a very uncomfortable square. So there's this move queen d5, and here we cannot take because then we would lose the queen, lose the game, and we would be very sad. So going back, we cannot exactly take here. So you have to be very careful and you have to be very deliberate with your pawn breaks. Sometimes the best way to improve your position is to go for a pawn break. And when you don't know what to do, look for pawn breaks to open up the position. Now let's look at this position right here. This game that I'm about to show you was actually played between two very strong players. Anatoly Karpov, former world champion with the white pieces, versus Wolfgang Unziker. So in this position, a lot of you might know this game already, but if you look at this position, you're going to notice that white's pieces are all developed. Like the rook is on e1, the knight is on d2, this knight is on f3, the bishop, the rook, they all have scope except this bishop on c1. This is the only undeveloped piece right now. But the position is still very closed. The center is closed. Only the a file is open here. Everything else is pretty much closed in this position. Now in this case, what Anatoly Karpov played was this move pawn to b4. Now sometimes you're not going to be able to come up with an easy plan. And in a position like this, what do you do? Because you don't really have a good way to continue the game. And sometimes the best thing to do is to restrict your opponent's pieces. You don't have to focus on your pieces necessarily. You can focus on your opponent's pieces as long as your king is safe and as long as there are no other issues in the position. So in this case, a move like b4 is a very strong move because the pawn on b4 will pretty much remain here forever. If you take it, well, what white will do is simply take back. And now with this knight right here cannot develop to either c6 or e6. If it goes to b7, which is its only square, it cannot develop to a5 or c5 either. So this move b4 actually completely restricts this knight and takes away squares from it. And from this point onward, you have to remember this. Whenever you don't have a clear win in the position, whenever you're still in this sort of a middle game phase, you're trying to figure out what you want to do, focus on slow improvement. Slowly improve your pieces. So b4 is an improving move because it takes away your opponent's squares. And let's see what happens after this. Knight to b7 was played. Now knight f1. Karpov is trying to improve his bishop. He's trying to develop it. He's also trying to improve his knight. So slow improvement. Bishop to e3. Again, slow improvement. Queen d2, slow improvement. Bishop d3, slow improvement. You're in no rush in these types of positions because the center is closed, the position is closed, the kings are both very, very safe. You're not going to be able to attack black's king so easily. You're not going to be able to attack white's king at all. White's king is actually much safer because of all these pieces that are around the king. But Karpov in this position is slowly improving the position. Bishop to f8, rook to a2, trying to double up, pawn to c4, bishop to b1, queen to d8, and now bishop to a7. And this is another very, very nice move because after bishop to a7, what Karpov is going to do is he's just going to move the bishop and take the entire a file. And the thing is, there's no way to get rid of this bishop. If you take it with the rook, well, you're sacrificing the rook. So what's the point? Now you're going to be down in material and white is much, much better. But there's no other way to increase the pressure on this bishop right here. One way you can try to attack this bishop is if you move the rook to c7 and then move the queen, move the knight back to d8, you would have to get like a crazy, uncomfortable configuration of pieces. But again, this doesn't work either because of bishop b6, a very simple tactic. So this is just a very uncomfortable position for the black pieces. And what Karpov is doing is just slowly improving the position. He knows he doesn't have a crazy checkmate here. He can't exactly go for an easy pawn break either, but he's just slowly and methodically improving the position, putting the bishop back on b1, knight to e2, and then knight to h2. Now, once he has developed and improved all of his pieces to their maximum capabilities, you can't really get any better than this at this stage of the game. He's looking for a pawn break. Remember what we talked about earlier? We need a pawn break in a position like this because we need to open up the position. So in this case, let's say bishop to g7, Karpov plays f4, f6 is played, then he plays f5. And from here, I'm going to briefly go over the game. I'm not gonna go in too much depth because that's not exactly what this video is about. But what Karpov does is that he slowly improves his position. Then he makes an advantageous trade. Look at all of these pawns on dark squares. This is black's good bishop and this is black's bad bishop because this bishop is completely walled in by its own pawns, and this bishop does not have a lot of scope practically, but it has a lot of scope theoretically because the pawns are on dark squares. Once we get rid of this though, once we're able to remove this bishop from f7 and actually trade it, which happens a couple of moves later, as you can see, now there are light square weaknesses in the position. Queen h5, queen g6, and then after king to f8, knight to h5. I don't know why Lichess is lagging there. It shows like an inaccuracy symbol, then it disappears. I don't know what's going on there, but as you can see, there are a lot of weaknesses in black's position, a lot of light square weaknesses, and that is because we got rid of black's light square bishop, and this is just a very winning position. And actually I believe here Unziker resigned in this position. So when you don't know what to do in a position, try to slowly improve your pieces. Let me go all the way back to this position right here. Let's say you don't know what to do here. Bishop to a7, trying to actually double up on the a file, trying to occupy the only open file on the board, and then once again slowly improving the position. And then once you improve your position, then going for a pawn break to open up the position, because if you never go for a pawn break and if both sides don't go for a pawn break, the game is just going to be a draw because the position never opens up. It's like you're trying to fight an enemy army, but you're not engaging with the enemy army, and the enemy army is not engaging with you either. Like, well, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to have a battle, but if you're not going to open up the position, you're not going to have a battle. That's why you need a pawn break, and you need to look for pawn breaks whenever you're in these types of closed positions. Now I briefly want to talk about the differences between open positions and closed positions. Whenever you have an open position, generally it's easier to come up with a plan because what you're trying to do is just putting the rooks on open lines and having the bishops on open diagonals where they can pressure things. And the thing is, It's very easy to come up with a plan in an open position, and generally people know what to do in open positions, because the only thing you have to look for are targets, in this case e6, and also open files, in this case, it's a semi-open file for the white pieces. This is the semi-open file for the black pieces. So you have to see where your pieces are open and where they have the most scope, and that's where you want to go. And generally that's easily done in open positions, because it's a very simple plan. You can just go rook to e5. Let's say rook to f6 is played. You can go rook e5 here. Let's say rook here. You're gonna go f3. And let's say opponent tries some counterplay. Let's say bishop c4 here. It's not the best move according to the computer, but it's good enough. So let's say g5, rook to e1, and you have a position like this where you're increasing the pressure. So whenever you have a position that is open, just like this, with open lines, open diagonals, it doesn't have to be fully open, like all the pawns don't need to be gone, but whenever you have at least a semi-open position, you should look for targets, and you should try to put your pieces on open lines and diagonals. But whenever you have a closed position, such as let's say this position, you have to look at the pawns, and you have to look at the pawn structure and pawn breaks. So in this case, let's look at white's pawn break. So white has a couple of different options here. Actually, there's really just two good options. Actually, one of them is not good at all. I was going to say c3, but the problem with c3 is that after d takes c3 and then b takes c3, all of a sudden there's a target for the black pieces. So this move c3 actually opens up black's scope to this d3 pawn, and now this d3 pawn becomes a huge target. So this c3 pawn break in this case is not a very good move. It's not a good move at all. It's actually a huge mistake. But what's another pawn break? Remember the rule of the pawn chain? If you don't know that, go watch that video. I have a video on the rule of the pawn chain. I'm gonna leave the link in the pinned comment below, so go watch that video. That video explains that you have to play on the side of the board where your pawn chain is looking towards. The pawn chain starts from c2, it goes to d3 and e4. So a natural follow-up would be something like f4. That's not possible right now because there's a knight on f3, but just move the knight. Just simply move the knight, and now you can play for the f4 pawn break. Let's say knight to e8 is played by black. We can go f4, opponent goes f6, and we can go f5, and now we can start a huge pawn storm on this side of the board. Once again, the rule of the pawn chain, you want to play on the side where your pawns are looking towards. So the pawns are looking this way, you want to go g4, h4, and then go g5. And that is how you come up with plans, and that is how you come up with ideas on what to do in the types of positions where you're not exactly sure what you're supposed to be doing.